Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to our work session. Commissioner Rothstein, thank you for joining us. Just a reminder that we are streaming live on the CCPS website and broadcasting on CET Channel 21. Today's work session is on the Educational Facilities Master Plan. This Educational Facilities Master Plan is a long-range planning document that evaluates our current school facilities, analyzes our future facility needs, and recommends solutions to address these needs. After today's work session, the plan will be brought to the board for approval at our regular meeting on Wednesday, June 14th. I would like to strongly remind each and every one of you that we still have not completed implementing the Blueprint for Maryland's future. Full implementation of Blueprint will impact our decisions on many of these items we are discussing today. And with that, I will turn things over to the new Dr. McCabe.
Thank you. Good evening, board members, and thank you for agreeing to this special work session. We thought that given some notable changes in our planning information and a couple other moving parts unique this year, it would be ideal to hold this work session on the Educational Facilities Master Plan, the EFMP. In this manner, you can hear details on several related topics and make more informed decisions on the updated EFMP. The EFMP is our 10-year capital planning document. It is a document that is required by the state, but one that we also use to prioritize when we prepare your annual CIP, when it comes to you for discussion each September prior to your approval in October. There's a good deal of information we would like to present, including revised enrollment projections, updates on changes since the SARC report, the feasibility studies for additions at Freedom Elementary and Sykesville Middle, and some initial information of how the blueprint impacts the capital program. We have had a lot to work through and would like to have a healthy discussion with you. So I'd propose that we move right into the presentation, and I'll ask Mr. O'Neill and team to get started.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McCabe, and good evening, board members. We do have quite a bit of information here. We do promise to try to work through it as quickly as we can. We won't spend a ton of time on each and every slide in the presentation, but we do want to make sure we answer your questions as we go and also allow for some time for some healthy discussion with you. By the end, you have a pretty substantial packet that I think you received with some days in advance, and just so everyone's clear on all the things that might be referenced throughout. In addition to a copy of the presentation you're seeing, you do have a revised Educational Facilities Master Plan with the major or significant changes or proposed changes highlighted, I think, in yellow. And even though the enrollment projections are in the EFMP, we pulled out the projections and are showing them in a different format, and Mr. Kane will reference that as we go. Then you do have two full copies of the two architecture and engineering feasibility studies for Sykesville and Freedom. You have the full sets in your packet, and since it's been a bit of time, we thought we would ask Mr. Prokop to summarize sort of where SARC left off when they presented their report to you roughly in the August-September 2022 timeline. So there's a one-page summary, and even though at least one of your two policies that might be discussed or referenced tonight are in the master plan as well, we pulled out copies of board policy FB, which is where you as a board define what an adequate facility is or an inadequate facility based on utilization versus capacity. So when we use those terms like inadequate or approaching inadequate, you can have that frame of reference. And then lastly, the policy JCAA boundary exceptions, which just sort of lays out the process for redistricting. So with those reference points in mind, what we want to do is work through kind of the topics that Dr. McCabe referred to. Honestly, at the end of this work session, it's pretty narrow in terms of very specific direction we'll be asking you for. We'll be wanting to know, are you comfortable with the major changes we're proposing and highlights in the master plan? Those would be things like, are you okay if we move forward with any of these modernization or additions from the feasibility studies in any part? Are you comfortable with the enrollment projections? Do you understand them? We've updated the modernization schedule by by assessing schools built after 1980, which changes the priority list a little bit. Things like that are the specific things we'll sort of need some guidance from, or at least know that you're comfortable with. But there's so much context surrounding those little things that's what we wanted to take some time presenting tonight, both relative to changes in the master plan, but then also when Mr. Kane and Mr. Prokop get into enrollment looks a little bit different than it has leading up to the pandemic even. But it especially changes what SARC was looking at as a committee at the time that they met and had their discussions and deliberations. So those are the kind of highlights we want to work through. So with that, we're going to ask Mr. Kane to work through enrollment, and then Mr. Prokop work through SARC and the feasibility studies. Bill will have a little bit of information on pre-K enrollment relative to the blueprint, and then we'll kind of have concluding discussions and thoughts at that time. Bill.
So the Educational Facility Master Plan is the long-range document that identifies the facility needs for the school system. Four major categories are included in the plan. Today we're going to focus on three. The four need types are capacity needs, modernization needs, instructional needs, and capital renewal needs. Capacity needs are based on the enrollment projections and the capacity of the schools, so we look at utilization and identify issues and concerns based on those utilization rates. And I'll go through the projections, the current projections in a little bit. The modernization needs are based on the facility condition index scores, which are in the master plan, but also functional assessment, which was done for schools built prior to 1980 originally, but this past year we looked at schools built between 1980 and 1990 to update that because it's been some time since the original assessment was done. And then finally, for the instructional needs, one of the major changes that we're dealing with is the blueprint, obviously, and right now, the pre-K expansion is the biggest component in the facility master plan that we're trying to look at. But at the end, I think we'll touch on a little bit of the other issues. So we'll start by looking at the enrollment projections, which drive the capacity needs. The September 30th enrollment this year was 25,787. That was 745 more than expected. So the projected enrollment from just, I guess it's a year and a half ago now, didn't anticipate that increase.
Yeah, here, let me put it in here.
The majority of that increase was at the elementary level. There was over 400 additional elementary students that we saw.
Okay.
And that's pretty typical when we see folks moving into the county, moving into the schools. Generally, they do it when they have younger kids as opposed to older kids. We did look at where are all these students coming from, and there are some that I guess we could have anticipated coming back from homeschool and private school after the pandemic, and that was about 30% of the increase that we saw, but the remainder was students transferring from other public school systems, either in-state or from out of state, which is a large increase and not unprecedented, but it's probably been since the early 2000s, late 90s, since we've seen the influx of students from transferring in from other counties. So a lot of that's attributed to the housing market and the demand. We're still a county, I think, that folks want to move to for a lot of reasons. And it appears that although new home construction, I would say, hasn't really increased much over the last 10 years, it's still roughly around 400 to 500 permits a year average, compared to in the heyday of the 90s and early 2000s we were 1,000 to 1,500 new homes a year. But there are definitely people moving into the county. So if the new homes aren't driving it, I would say it's existing homes are basically turning over as older families whose kids have moved on are looking to resell, and younger families are moving in. So,
Mr. Kane, what area was a lot of that growth?
It really is across the county. There are Schools in the Northeast, there's schools in the Northwest. I wouldn't say every school, but there are, it is spread relatively throughout the county. The Freedom area, the Eldersburg area, probably, when you look, has consistently over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen that in that area more consistently, but this past year, the growth was really somewhat spread throughout the county. So. The current projections, I just highlighted the 5-year projection, which is the 2027 projection. At the elementary level, we're projected to be a little over 12,700. That's 803 higher than last year's projection for that year. I would highlight that at least half of that is from the pre-K projections. Last year's projection document assumed that we would continue with the current pre-K enrollment of basically 20 kids at each of the schools that offer pre-K. This year, in this year's projections, based on Blueprint, we're assuming that we're going to double our pre-K enrollment over the next 5 years. So it builds, progressively over the next 5 years, but by the time you get to 2027, we're looking at double the amount of pre-K enrollment. I talked to a lot of other counties. It's kind of, that's our best guess at this point. It's really hard to know because it's a voluntary program and there's a lot of mechanics of partial funding for folks that are in, certain categories. It's under 300% of federal poverty level. All 3 and 4 year olds are eligible, but once you get above 300%, there's a graduated scale of funding. So it's hard to know how many people will take advantage of it, but it's kind of the best guess we have at this point. The middle school enrollments are approximately 388, almost 400 higher than last year's projections. Again, the bulk of that, the majority of that is based on those higher elementary enrollments because remember, elementary students today will be middle schoolers in 5 years. So, and then finally high school is the current projections are about 500 higher than last year. So, but, and it's progressive. The students those extra 700 students that show up today raise the out-year projections because they're going to progress through the grades. So and they also raise the survival ratios that are used to project future enrollment. So when we see jumps in actual enrollment like that, the enrollment projections in the future the line, I guess, gets raised as the new base is higher. So that's just generally the projections themselves. Now, how do we apply that to capacity needs? We look at utilization rates, which is the enrollment compared to the capacity. And based on the Board of Education's policy on adequate facilities, this year's master plan has 9 inadequate elementary schools. For everyone to understand what that means, it means per the board policy, over 105% of the school's capacity. Last year we had, in last year's facility master plan, there were 4 schools, 4 elementary schools that were inadequate. So there is an increase, obviously, with those additional students coming in. One caveat, and this is where the handout that John referenced helps a little bit. If you look at the enrollment projections in the educational facility master plan document, the large document, the future capacity of additions, of the pre-K additions, is not anticipated in the facility master plan and the calculation of utilization. The reason for that is that they haven't been funded in the capital budget yet. We got funding to do a feasibility study, but we have not gotten funding for the individual addition projects. You'll notice in the enrollment projection document, though, that the 4 kindergarten/pre-K additions at Sandy Mount, Friendship Valley, Cranberry Station, and Tawnytown do have the additional capacity built in for their utilization rates. So that's because those have been funded. We start design this summer on those projects. So that these charts here, the extra handout, just add the pre-K capacity in to give you an idea of what it would look like with that additional pre-K capacity. because remember, the enrollments are in there, the projected increase in pre-K enrollments are in there. So I just wanted to show everyone that those pre-K additions will help. And there's a few schools on here that, Ebb Valley, for instance, is projected to be over 105%, but if you add the pre-K addition in, that would bring the school below 105%, So that's the elementary look. The middle school, the current master plan has 2 inadequate middle schools. For middle schools, it's over 110% of capacity. And the 2 schools are Oklahoma Road Middle and Sykesville Middle, and those 2 schools were also in last year's plan, and we're over 110%. This year, though, we do have 3 approaching inadequate, whereas last year's master plan only had one middle school approaching inadequate. So again, that's the additional students that we're seeing and the increase in middle school projections. At the high school level, the current projections have 3 high schools that are be approaching inadequate, which approaching is anything over 100% but under 110%. The 3 schools are Century, Liberty, and Manchester Valley. They're far in the out year, closer to the 10-year projection. But if you looked at last year's master plan, there were 0 high schools that were over 100%. So.
Mr. King?
Sure.
I just want to be clear. Am I on, or?
Yeah.
Okay, I think so. So the elementary schools in the southeast part of the county, 5 of the 6 currently are being rated as inaccurate or inadequate for 2027. Is that correct?
You're looking at the handout, correct?
I am.
Right.
So from 108% all the way up to 124%?
Correct.
And
So
then
4
one-
of the 5, right. The last line is a total
Oh, I
line.
apologize. 4
That's
out of the
okay.
5, yeah.
That's okay.
And then one of the one of the middle schools, Sykesville Middle, and then 2 of the high schools getting close to that with Liberty and Century, or?
They're approaching inadequate, which, I believe Century in 2032 is like the last year of the projection. I believe it's like 102%, which is, like 20. It's a small number over, but anything over 100% is technically approaching inadequate by the Board of Education policy.
Okay. I just feel like it's a balloon effect, You increase adequacy and inadequacy in one area, you try to squeeze it out to create adequacy, you're then creating inadequacy in other locations. And this is not even like blueprint related, this is just numbers. So it's just important for the community to understand the numbers as we're also developing down in the southeast, but the development down in the southeast, there's this concern that we're overgrowing, but the development is actually slow. It takes time to build homes, to get homes in and stuff like that. This is outside of all of that as well, correct? Or are you calculating
The
home growth?
The enrollment projections are based on actual enrollments, which are influenced by a lot of factors, but
Uh-huh.
past development and new home construction over the
Okay.
past has influenced it. So
Yeah.
if a school district had 300 homes built over the last 5 years, the projections are based on that kind of one of many assumptions, but based on that rate would continue. So yes, the past influences the future projections. So if there was growth, now if an elementary school had 0 growth for 4 years and all of a sudden there was going to be 800 homes built in the next 3-4 years, that's unanticipated. The projections wouldn't have that built in. But we do the projections every year so that as those students show up from that growth, it's captured in the calculations. So it accounts for growth, but maybe not in the way that everybody has a different view of how it ought to be captured.
Or different views of what it means.
Right, correct.
And so what we have looked at over time for different purposes
Yeah.
are like county studies of yield rates. Because to each person, they see those homes and they say, well, my gosh, there's this many more kids will be in school next year.
Right.
But, actually, I think it was county, we had a study a few years ago from county demographers, I believe, on like what were the yield rates of new homes during the highest period of growth in
Yep.
Carroll County Public Schools history. And it's, if that data remains sound today, it's not what people believe necessarily.
Wasn't it
and
6 to 1? You needed 6.
It was more like a ratio per household. I'd have to pull it up.
Yeah.
But it's,
Two-way or something
but,
like that.
but the point is, it's relatively small. And it's hard to convey that message collectively to the community.
Oh, yeah.
Because they see growth in houses being built. They're like, oh, our schools are gonna be overrun because every house is gonna have 3 elementary schools, feeding into the school, and that's not a true statement.
And it's more
And-
complex than that. It's somewhat new construction, depending on what yield rates are. It's turnover of the existing inventory. An older couple may be selling to a younger
Right.
family. And Bill does look at birth rates from Department of Planning as well to sort of try to project out what would be a kindergarten group.
I-
in a-
I think the reason I'm surfacing this is if we can figure out, which is a huge ask, how we can package a response to the community. That's a joint response from the commissioners, from, the local municipalities, and from the Board of Education, I think can go a long ways. Because if not, social media, as we know, people do their own calculations, and all of a sudden, we're being overwhelmed. And I don't know. I mean, that's most of my battle is how do I get confidence in the community saying, no, you're not going to be overrun in Carrolltown or other community, schools because of some of this growth. That's not happening.
And maybe the next section will sort of
Okay.
address, I think we'll begin to tease out different themes that are being
yeah.
somewhat shared so far this evening from board members and from you, Commissioner. The next thing we want to do is look at, okay, with these newest enrollment projections, how does that compare to what SARC had in front of it? And then what would that mean, or what may that mean to the Board of Ed relative to SARC's original recommendations? And it's your plan at the end of the day. It's not my plan. It's not our plan. But I think in this discussion, sort of the theme we'll be hitting on is maybe a measured approach is the best way to handle this, because I think President Herbert mentioned the blueprint at the start of this. There's still some fairly significant unknowns there, and some of them aren't resolvable. Like, we don't know what will happen if private daycares
Right.
don't materialize who want to participate under the
Right.
blueprint. Does the state say then it's up to the Board of Ed to find all the seats? Because that changes everything.
Right.
We're working from the assumption that we're on the hook for 50% of those slots. But for instance, and Ray's probably crossing through all of his notes, if we're looking at the possibility of an addition or two anyway and what they might look like, and we know we're going to be looking at pre-K additions, now we're clearer on that than we were a year ago when we were speculating on the blueprint. Okay, what can we do? What might you want to do relative to those pre-K additions that will likely be underway anyway, to also address utilization and capacity and certain. So there's more moving parts than there have ever been, and those are the kinds of things you're actually anticipating the kinds of things we were hoping to tease out tonight in the discussion. There's cards everywhere. I don't know who to call on.
Go ahead, Mr. Whistler.
You're on.
I'm on, okay. Hope I'm still on. Again, Mr. Kane, just again, development issues, permitting definitely impacts school enrollment. In your mathematical modeling for projecting, are you looking at things like, if we have a recession, or if we have inflationary period where people lose their jobs, people take their kids out of homeschooling, or they take them out of private care and enroll them into the schools? Is that part of your mathematical modeling as well?
So it only in that it impacts past enrollments. So it's historic enrollments and the historic succession from one grade to the next. So if you had 100 first graders one year and then the next year you had 105 second graders, there's some growth there because the next 5 more students showed up. Sometimes you'll have 100 first graders and the next year you only have 90 second graders. Well, people are leaving. So like the actual historical enrollments and their ratios of moving from grade to grade are what is used to project the future. Those things are all factors that influence Is each one specifically called out? That would be like a multiple regression analysis, which would be very complicated, and I think other counties have tried to do it where they have 4 or 5 planners, and the accuracy is the same.
Sure.
Cohort survival is what all of the other counties use. It's what the Maryland Department of Planning uses. It is somewhat simple, but also the fact that you're looking at history, all of those things influence the enrollments. So yes,
Yeah,
now.
what you said was exactly, I was thinking, do we do some sort of regression analysis? What are the meaningful coefficients? Things like, are we actually looking at census data? For example, if we have 1,000 kids that can go to our elementary
Yeah.
schools in a region, but only 400 attend,
The census data isn't good enough to be able to do that. They used, 20 years ago, they stopped doing a full census, so the census data now is a
it's just
shell of what it
postulation,
used to
right?
be.
Okay,
The
thank
air,
you.
yep.
Appreciate it.
The only thing else I was going to say is, we do not have pre-K businesses knocking at our door saying, come on, we want to do this. So I think we're going to be holding the bag on that. Pretty much, not a lot. Go ahead, Ms. Battaglia.
I was gonna say, kind of something that Mr. Whistler was talking about, that, like, we always look at, what is coming down the pipeline as far as permits and any buildings. For example, I know the Ebb Valley and Manchester area, there really hasn't been much development as far as homes. A lot of that is people, moving or, so, you're having that, new families coming in. So I know that has a good bit to do with it, and I know many people here know how much I just love projections. But it's, we're gonna have an issue here because these were schools we weren't anticipating
Right, not in that time.
6 years ago to have this issue, and now that we have this. So
Right,
it-
with net immigration, right, which hasn't happened in quite some time,
Wow.
right?
yeah.
People coming into the county, so, and I think that there's some reasons behind that, but.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah. And it's a good thing, and, but, I think it's also interesting to understand the cohort survival, right, and how that impacts, so if the elementary schools are in the southeast area are overcrowded on average today, then how does that flow through to Liberty and Century? You don't see it right away, like really, it's in the very tail end of the projections, right? Like, so Liberty and Century are fine out until like 2032 or so, but then you start seeing the effects of the elementary schools kind of surviving. But we have some time to deal with that situation, but we don't have time to deal with the elementary situation, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So, Ray is itching to go. Like, I think more or less our collective takeaway, and we've certainly talked to the superintendent a good bit, so before the pandemic, at least I was saying things like, look, I'm not a statistician, but it seems like to me we've hit our plateau maybe where we're not going lower, and maybe we're ticking up. Now, I would say, as not a statistician, we're clearly
On the
clearly
uptick.
growing again.
Right.
And we're growing again in more places than just the Freedom area. And even with just this 1 year's projection, this new set of projections, it informs what we might want to look at in the Freedom area, because we also might want to start become paying attention to other parts of the county, like William, Winchester, and Sandy Mount. We'll talk about that at the end. So, that's there. And so then what are the right steps to take? And something I probably should have said on the lead-in slide, I'll say it again at the end. If you do make a decision tonight relative to your master plan, it's not a permanent decision either. If you say, let's move this addition into the plan, you'll have another bite at that apple when you vote on your CIP in October. You'll have, and that would just be to seek funding for design the next summer. You'd have another opportunity to change your master plan before then. So the fate of the world doesn't rest on your shoulders this evening with the kind of guidance we're looking for this version of the master plan, because this is evolving, and the blueprint is very much evolving, or at least continuing, if not evolving.
The
Miss-
EFMP is always, you're trying to make the decisions on the best information that you have at the
the
time, but
time.
that information is always going to change,
Right.
right? Like, projections never play out exactly
Right.
the way you project them. But you're trying to follow trends and figure out what is the right way to go directionally.
That-
But-
right, and that's why it's updated annually. You know, some plans you might create a plan and go 5, 8 years without revisiting, but the facility master plan, because it is influenced by, you know, the changing enrollments and changing instructional models, you know, all of those things, we look at it every year, so.
All right. So, the projections that Bill just presented, we wanted to see how that related to the SARC decision-making and the primary options that were provided to the board. As John mentioned, we provided a summary sheet, just as at a glance, you can see where we've been since 2019 with the issues surrounding the southern end of the county. As a reminder, the assumptions that SARC used during while they developed their options was to use a 5-year enrollment look, the 2022 enrollments, but we were looking 5 years out, as Bill's already doing this evening. And the committee's process can utilize that marker to maintain, to be as consistent as possible, to use the same methodology as we progress through all of our options. 2 of the 3 primary options that were provided to the board had capital solutions as a part of them. More capital, that we use capital solutions, they will reduce the number of students impacted by any boundary line adjustments. So the board elected to direct staff to do feasibility studies for Freedom Elementary and Sykesville Middle. We will get to those, but I wanted to hit the projections first to see how the projections are affecting what it is that SARC was looking at. So the first thing is we're going to do a 30,000-foot view on this thing. We're not going to try to do boundary lines and whatnot. What we're looking for is where we've highlighted here on the total. As a committee, the 22 projections, we're looking at 26 enrollments. And what we were dealing with at the elementary level at the southern end of the county there for that group of schools was 189 seats surplus. So that gave us flexibility. But if you recall, when we discussed the issue of Mount Airy being on the western end of the county and the rest of the schools and the problems being on the eastern side, it's not a simple matter of just moving lines and moving kids over. The parameters that were established by the committee, we followed. We had to, of course, take into account the impacts to transportation services. And so it's not a simple matter using that 189 just doesn't solve the issue right off the bat, but it doesn't get better with the current projections. So at 2027, using the 23 projections using 27 as our target, we lose 180 of those surplus seats, pretty much taking away any real options, easy options, easy targets as we would go to move boundary lines. So that's a pretty big jump. What we wanted to do, though, is to say, okay, we're looking at the feasibility studies for additions. That direction was given. What would that look like if we were to move forward with those additions? How would that change that bottom line figure? And you can see we jump back up to 121 seats if we do the 5-classroom addition at Freedom. The 5-classroom is the smaller option. So it heads in the right direction. It doesn't solve all the problems, as you can see. The problems still remain in terms of where exactly to draw those lines and the impacts to transportation and the other parameters we looked at. If we look at the larger addition, we're looking at far more seats. Obviously, the issue with this, we'll get into it a little bit with the when we look at the feasibility studies. Is that this is one that we would, recommend or suggest we not do simply because of the impact to the site. But we can look at that a little bit further when we, but you can see that that the capital solutions do provide some relief from the issues associated with the increased projections. And when we look at middle schools, we can fit those onto one slide. We can see the difference. It essentially triples our problem. We had 90 seats that we were trying to, 90-seat deficit in the region for middle schools that we were trying to solve for. Now we're over 300. So it continues, the situation, not surprisingly, gets worse with this year's projections. But if we look at the two possible additions, the 4 classroom, 10 classroom additions, the situation eases. So it's there for us. The larger addition at Sykesville does present itself as a viable option for sure. The high schools was never really a major issue. There's a surplus of seats. There are fewer, but we're still in good shape with the high schools. So if we move into the actual feasibility studies and what information we're gleaning from those, we looked at 2 options for each, for Freedom and 2 options for Sykesville. So the first one, for Freedom, the 5 classroom addition, we're looking at pre-K there. I'm sorry, I just lost my notes here. We're the one workroom, resource room, girls, boys, staff restrooms, and we're looking at $5.3 million anticipated cost for that. There we go. The addition will be placed on the academic wing or the classroom wing adjacent to the playground area. It would be a single story. It would it would require a small amount of renovation to make the connection, but not a whole lot of renovation for the interior, to the existing interior building. When we're looking at the 9 classroom addition,
Sorry, Ray, could you go back to that for
Sure.
a minute? So that's in the back of the building.
yes.
Is that where like the playground area is right now?
Yeah, it would be adjacent to the playground. We're looking to avoid the impact to it during construction. Whether we would have to take it out of service during construction, we'd still have to look at those details.
Okay.
But it would have to, if we took something out of service, we'd be replacing it.
Okay.
I probably should publicly note that if you recall when you toured the sites, that was the area that now Commissioner Kyler suggested would make the most sense for an addition. I told him I would say that out loud. He was
Thank
right.
you, John.
He knew.
So the second option at Freedom is a 2-story, 9 classroom addition. Includes a pre-K, 1 kindergarten classroom, 2 workrooms, 3 resource rooms, staff and student restrooms. Estimated cost of about $9.5 million. The addition will be placed similar to the smaller addition, except that it will continue all the way over to the kindergarten, the existing kindergarten wing, and tie in at that point. And you can see that tie-in, that connection, is going to require modifications to the kindergarten spaces there for egress, and also for flow through the building. It has that advantage that it provides a nice flow through the building. And again, both of the options do improve the bus, the bus situation there, the bus access, and also separates the parent and student pickup and drop off. The difficulty is, though, that there's only a small number of additional parking spaces. So our concern is with a larger addition, it's going to exacerbate an already difficult situation. So that's one of our biggest concerns there is a 10-acre site. We're trying to stuff an awful lot in there. So the recommendation would be the smaller addition.
Can I just say something at this point?
Yes.
But with that, with the smaller number of classrooms, you're really only taking care of the students who are, let's say, housed in the portables. at this
Correct.
time.
That's right.
So those would be the only students that you'd be bringing into the building. Again, improving the parking and the flow of the traffic there. But I'm
Well,
just-
it would be also the capacity would be, now that we have the students in bricks and mortar, the capacity itself increases, so the utilization will decrease.
Okay, and I know, and later we'll get to the pros and the cons, because again, it just seemed to me, even though there were, pros and cons associated with both, and I hear what you're saying about, really being concerned about the site itself as far as the number of classrooms. To me, I'm just looking at what the lower number of classrooms, that
So-
all that we'd be going through to get the 4 or 5 classrooms, compared to what we'd be doing to get non-classrooms and having more of a future look
So,
to
so
that.
slide 12 kind of shows you, back to some of the other slides, but the new capacity of the smaller addition would be 637. The projected enrollment for Freedom is 655. So they would be 18 over that capacity. The idea behind the larger would be that we would be moving, tied with a redistricting, moving students actually into Freedom to fill it. The smaller addition would mostly take care of Freedom's projected overcrowded. If we built the larger one, we would then use that for capacity to relieve other schools that are overcrowded in the region. So, and it would be creating a 5-round school, which is 5 classrooms per grade level, which there's only 2 in the county, Linton Springs and Manchester Elementary. Mount Airy and Pars work like an 8-round school, eight classes, but it would be putting one of our largest elementaries on one of our smallest school sites with the least amount of parking and the smallest bus loop, so.
Bill, explain what you mean by a 4 or 5 round school.
Well, 4 round is 4 classrooms per grade level, so 4 kindergarten, 4 first grade, 4 second grade. 5 is 5 kindergarten, 5, so,
I get that.
yeah.
Couple questions. One, do these plans include like a pre-K playground, or that's not included in the plans, the funding? Playgrounds
It's
with-
not, no, not in these.
Okay, and then the other question, I mean, again, this is the assumption that you're gonna have that many teachers, that many rooms, but with Blueprint and the 75% compensatory ed requirement and the movement of teachers, we're gonna have all these rooms, but not enough teachers to fill all the rooms. So have we thought about maybe knocking down walls, making class sizes bigger? Because if we, if we only have so many teachers at that site, I think we're supposed to pull, 12 or 13 maybe? Has any thought gone into, changing the size of the classrooms to accommodate larger class sizes if we are required to meet that Blueprint mandate?
The short answer to that is no, not yet. In the longer term, we are going to have to rethink a lot of things as a school system. Mr. Whistler, I don't think we'd be at a place today where we'd be comfortable saying make those kinds of capital changes to buildings. We keep, I think I could speak for, we keep hoping for a greater level of clarity. We have heard, at least I feel like I've heard a rising crescendo among other school systems not named Carroll lately, sort of seeking similar types of guidance, like, is this what this really means, or is there some flexibility to deal with this differently or over time? And I do think, and this is just me saying this for whatever that's worth, which I do think the state is going to have to answer some of those questions in the next couple of years, but we're not at a place where we'd suggest changing a building from a capital standpoint to that. But that remains out there. You raised it at the start of this meeting. The last slide, I think, is going to reference that again. Like, there are some other unknowns. Even pre-K is an unknown. If those private slots don't show up, does the state grant the waiver forever, or do they say to the local boards of ed, you figure it out? Because then that changes your whole capital calculus
There's
forever.
too many variables
There's a
right now.
lot there.
And I think the biggest thing is money right now. Where are we going to get all this money from to do all this? For starting with the Blueprint, and that's why I made that one of my first statements, because there are so many unknowns with Blueprint and the mandates that they're bringing to us and the influx of the MSDE and AIB now trying to figure out who's in charge and money flow, I think they're going to have to relook and restructure, because there is just no way that all of our counties can do what they're mandating, asking us to do without help. And that's why I went down. And this is why we're talking today. But you can't knock down walls and then they go, oh, we're not going to do 60-40. But I understand that, because, but first of all, we're not going to be able to hire that many teachers, because we're all going to be fighting over the same ones.
And as Mr. O'Neill said, you know, we wouldn't feel comfortable at this point making decisions for classrooms at a certain school to house 40 students instead of 25 to 30 based on blueprint legislation.
Right.
Just because, you know, we don't know the final answers to a lot of these questions.
That'll be that bite at the apple again that
Yeah.
we'll take later on.
And to Dr. Dorsey, to your rather salient question, I actually in my own mind contemplated whether I would say what you said, but you asked the question. You could make a case that sort of what we would recommend would be to kind of recognize that those portables are always going to sit there, and so let's take care of that inside of the capacity of the school. So you're at least addressing utilization at the same time. There's some Freedom, and Bill might have to help me because in my memory's not what it was, but Freedom has a weird number of classrooms, and this could sort of round that out as well in terms of a permanent structure. It would take care of Freedom's capacity, as has been mentioned, but it would mitigate how much redistricting might have to happen in the area as well. And then, and we have a lot of dialogue with the instructional folks, Nick, or Mr. Shockney, Dr. Farver. I think they've talked to the principals in the area. But from sort of a capital standpoint, a facility standpoint, we're just not sure that even though the A&E study says it can, we're just not sure that site can really handle the 9. For instance, staff parking, would there be enough, or what additional dynamic would that add to Principal Smith's day? Either that wouldn't be something we would recommend, but it's certainly in the purview of the board to decide that. One of the things we'd like to throw out there for just your consideration as you discuss this is the idea of moving forward with the Sykesville edition. I know Ray hasn't gotten to that yet. Moving forward with the smaller Freedom edition for the reasons stated, and spending the next year having staff look at, are there other possibilities for other additions in that area that could provide relief, but also be paired with some pre-K expansion anyway. So there's all those parts coming back to play here.
And again, to circle back with the playground issue, Freedom doesn't have a pre-K classroom yet. So I really would like to see us consider the cost aspect for that new pre-K classroom and the playground. I just don't want to see that burden put on our PTAs.
Yeah, we didn't ask the architect for this scope study, feasibility study, to look at that, but if we were to move ahead with the addition, if the board wanted to, we would do a full design process. This isn't the end result of what the project would look like.
Great.
This is just a feasibility of, is it possible?
Sure.
So like, we certainly could, if the board directed us to include that in the project, we certainly
It's
would
the
do.
first pre-K classroom they'd get, so it's just
Right.
fair for the.
Well, and it's a requirement actually to become a pre-K certified program, so.
So the 9 classroom addition at Freedom it's feasible, it could be done, but it does make Freedom the largest elementary school on the smallest piece of
On 8
property in the
acres.
county.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
9
okay.
acres.
Yes.
It's crazy.
And
It should be 13
Jessica's
acres
here.
minimum.
I don't know if she's nodding in agreement or not, but our take would be that site's handling what it can handle without the larger addition. Or do you agree?
We'd love to
More or
hear
less.
from Ms. Smith if we could.
I was going to ask this, did anybody look to see if the addition could be built on the front of the school, the 2-story, where the portables currently are?
We wanted to use
Instead of the
that to
back?
try to mitigate some of the
We,
traffic issues.
and we would have to relocate the portables, which has the last double portable we moved was over 200,000. So we'd have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to move the portables, to move the kids, to be able to build the addition. So it would increase the cost pretty substantially to be able to do that.
Use
The
that as a
architect,
swing space.
the architect looked at it, but it would require moving the current portables, because they're housing kids. We'd have to do that over our summer, and then the kids would go back in the portables until the new addition was built. So
It would be the swing
It's-
space during
Didn't we do that at
construction.
Career and Tech, though? We did that at Career and Tech.
we
where
moved one double portable, but the size of that project, it was a 98,000 square foot addition. It could only go, it made sense in that case. In this case, when we talked about it, it didn't make sense financially or, overall. But it's possible if,
We wouldn't know where to put the kids during the construction.
we would have to move the portables to the back.
To a
Right.
different place on the same site, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm just looking at, because when I went and looked at the school and toured the school, to me, it made more sense to do it in the front, a 2-story, move the portables in the back for the time being, where possible the addition is, because it looked like there would have been a little bit more room to do something more.
And I'm not saying it's not possible, and it might make sense long-term, but it would probably cost $500 to $1,000 to $1 million to move the portables to be able to build the addition where the portables are. But yes, it's possible.
Jessica, what would you like to say about the whole situation? You are the principal there, and we don't want your feedback.
Well, currently, we have 3 grades with 5 classes and 3 grades with 4 classes. So we're really only 3 classrooms away from being 5 across the board. While we are kind of pushed to our limit sometimes when it comes to arrival and dismissal, I do believe we have a very good system in place that works successfully. So the bigger addition would be pushing, but I don't think it would be impossible for what we could handle in our cafeteria and other places if that was what the need was.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we appreciate what you do.
Ray?
Actually, can I ask a little bit more detail on that? Because you said that the cafeteria could handle it. Wasn't that one of the constraints that we had with building on Freedom, that you're already pushed to the maximum in your
We
your
are
number
at the
of shifts?
max for how we have for lunch shifts, so we have 3 hours of lunch shifts. But we can handle a full grade of 5 classes at each lunch shift and still have room for others. We just cannot combine lunch shifts like other places, so we have a little bit less flexibility. And there's a longer noisy period during the day while lunch is happening.
Thank you.
Okay, the Sykesville Middle additions, this was, the first one is it's a 2-story, 4-classroom addition, includes 2 workrooms, 2 resource rooms, student and staff bathrooms, estimated cost of about $5.5 million. The addition would be placed at the rear of the building adjacent to the existing classroom wing, and the addition will require a renovation to the existing building to allow access to the addition. The classrooms that are impacted would be replaced in the addition in this case. Second option, that's the second floor. The 10-classroom addition, as you can see, it's actually it's a larger 2-story addition and a smaller single-story addition. You can see the rooms that are intended to be provided with the two additions. The cost is about $13 million. This one, you can see the additions here. The larger addition is adjacent to the classroom wing. The smaller single-story addition is adjacent to the fine arts or the arts section of the building, and that impacts those special spaces such as art, health, family, consumer sciences, phys ed, and also addresses the needs for conference space and administrative space that are anticipated for an addition of this size, causing that sort of cascading effect in terms of those interior renovations.
My question was whether or not the lunchroom and the locker rooms could accommodate that, and maybe that's a question for Aaron, but Mr. Brillhart, I don't know Do you think that would
the
squeeze out
feasibility
your
study
locker
mentioned
room
that.
space and lockers and lunchroom and?
Locker rooms, I think, would be okay. We're running 3 classes per period right now, and so I'm not overly concerned with the capacity there. The cafeteria would be a struggle. Our 7th grade class is our largest class, and we're about 285 students. They're actually split into 2 groups right now. 285 in that particular space is tight. It starts getting into that comfort versus safety conversation. The other 2 classes are 240 right now. It's not an issue. With the projected numbers reaching 300 plus, and I believe Sykesville in years past, when they were at those numbers, had to offer multiple lunch shifts. If all 3 grades are there, we're looking at running 5 or 6 different lunch shifts, and that is a lot to do. So the rest of the renovation certainly suffices for all the other pieces that need to go to that puzzle, but the cafeteria would be an issue.
That was my question. I mean, we go to Sykesville all the time for sporting stuff and
Yeah.
but things like gym and, yeah, cafeteria.
Yeah, and so for those of you that haven't been there, the gymnasium does not have bleachers as part of the gym. So when you're talking about the court size, you have 3 feet beyond the basketball court, all the way around. That's about it.
Yep.
So it is a small space.
But I would assume, I would think the art teachers would be pleased that the art space would be,
Very much so.
yeah, developed,
Very much so.
you know.
Yeah, I think everybody in related arts would be pleased with the additions there. Some of the stuff has been updated, but it's a little bit smaller spaces than comparable schools. So that addition would be nice. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Kane, could I ask just a quick question? I'm looking at the Sykesville projections, the enrollment projections. And the reason I'm going to ask this is because I'm trying to understand what would be the impact on funding that we would be able to get from the state in doing an addition. But there's a decrease in enrollment at Sykesville in the projections to 2024, and then it pops back up really high again. What's driving the dip for
this-
1 year?
The size of the grades that are going to feed into it. So, you might have a small 4th grade class that's going to feed into it in 2 years. Or you might have a small 5th grade class at 2 of the feeder schools.
Okay.
The hard thing and I know it's hard for folks who don't do it, students don't come in neat groups of 100 or 80. Some years there's 100 and some years there's 65, and then the next year there's 120. It's somewhat, there's an average over the long term, but like there are times where there are these drops and it's like, why would it be dropping? But it's just because there's a small group feeding into it. Or some years you'll see an elementary school grow by 30 and you're like, where are all these kids? Well, it's just because they had a small 5th grade that was smaller than average move out, and then the kindergarten was average,
Right.
so they grew by 30. But it wasn't anything unusual other than they had a small cohort move through.
Right.
So really that's why middle schools would be dropping, because the students that are feeding into it are smaller than they typically would be.
But that means you should see the same dip in the feeder elementary schools, right?
You should see the dip
2 years earlier.
in the actual enrollments in that grade, but that grade might be low, but then the other grades might be up 20. So like, I mean, I'd be more than happy to look at all of it, but that's a kind of a detailed look at all the grade levels and all of the,
Right.
but if you look in the actual enrollment projection document, the part that has all the grades in the cohort, you can look to see what each grade is doing. And Sykesville's fed by multiple elementary schools, so it could be just one school, it could be 3 of the 5,
Yeah, okay, yeah, there must be something really interesting going on
Right.
in one of the schools, because you don't see the dip, you don't see that lower level
it's
at
not that
the
unu-
elementary schools feeding in.
It's not that unusual that happens, but like if you're not used to looking at them all the time and you just look at one, you probably, if you picked a school and looked at, oh, what's going on there? But like, it happens across the county in any given projection year pretty frequently, so.
Yeah, because sometimes when you look at the mobility, sometimes you have a lot of kids or a number of kids transferring out and a number of kids coming in. And sometimes when you just look at what the net effect is, you've had a lot of coming and going, but you
Right.
might be only showing a gain of 4 or 5 kids, but you've had, just a lot of mobility happening at the school. So
Right.
again, the numbers are interesting.
Yeah, and it's just there's something interesting going on behind the scenes, because when
So-
you look at the schools that feed into this, they're all at very high numbers, and they've all experienced increased enrollment, so you wouldn't expect that number to go
So-
down, but there's
So if you looked at if you look at the current sixth grade for Sykesville, it's 224. The seventh grade is 280, the eighth grade's 240. They average 250 to 275. That sixth grade, which is 220, which is low, moves out into high school after 2024. So there's a drop of 35, but it's mainly because that small cohort moves on to high
Right.
school.
Okay,
That's
Gotcha.
why there's a dip at Sykesville when that group moves out.
okay. So when we're talking about state funding in terms of, let's say we did the 10 classroom addition at Sykesville Middle with a projected cost of, what was it, 12 million something?
Yes, 12.7.
What would you expect state contribution to be, and would these projections impact that?
So
Because we're using a percent of functional capacity, right? But the state, do they base their contribution off of
the state,
the state rated
the
capacity?
state currently uses state rated capacity, and they currently use a square feet per student based on a junior high model. There's a secondary model that's the same for middle and high school, but it's based on the idea that students all are scheduled individually like the high schools. The middle school model schedules them as groups, as teams, or as grade levels. So there's a difference there. They are re-looking at it. They've been talking about it. Blueprint has them re-looking at the square feet per student. Whether by the time we would get there, whether that change is in place or not. But as of now, they would use state-rated capacity and look at your enrollments to say how many over your state-rated capacity are there. Now, the state IEC now has a waiver process where if you want to justify above and beyond their formula, you can make the pitch to the IEC and they can consider it. But again, that's hard to sit here today to say, yes, they would give us more than that, but it is a possibility.
Okay. Now, because we cross over the 100% on the state-rated capacity level in 2026, what period do they look at in terms of is it only actual enrollment? Do you have to physically have the problem
They look
already?
they look at the seventh year out
Seventh year
projected
out, okay.
enrollment. So they would be looking at, in the ballpark of 100, Sykesville's in the ballpark of 140, 150 over its state-rated capacity in 2028, 2029. They do look at adjacent schools to say, well, are there seats adjacent? Because they would lower potentially. But there's a back and forth where you could, again, ask for those to be excluded because of transportation policies or other community policies. But just looking straight at Sykesville, they would justify about 140 students. Now, then you take those 140 students, multiply it times the square feet per student. That gives you how many square feet they would participate in.
Okay.
And then they do a state-local cost share. Our cost share is 59% of that. So the formula kind of
It's never an easy answer.
it's not a one
to
not a
what
one
you-
calculation. It's
Yeah.
a multiple calculations.
And there are, as Bill said, there's appeal processes, there's ways that we can, and as we've seen with Career and Tech and East, we've received the benefit of those debates and those processes, but sometimes they're occurring as the project is occurring. It's very strange for us. Typically, these are decisions in the past. The state has made decisions, drawn a line, and you don't cross that line, and there's almost no chance to change that decision. Now there's it's gray, but it's benefited us.
And the staff does recognize at the state level that there are a large number of counties that have a middle school model that the utilization of the building is based on more of like a utilization rate of 75%, whereas the current secondary state-rated capacity has an 85% utilization rate. They acknowledge that that's real and that there's a lot of reasons to do the middle school model and that there is this dilemma. Their struggle is there's still counties using the junior high model, and how do they develop one formula that applies to all? And they haven't been able to come up with that, and what they tell us at our planners meetings or our correspondence is basically, we're gonna fund based on the state rate capacity in our current model, but the IAC created that waiver process for you, each project, to justify additional square footage above and beyond what our formula says, and they have been granting them. We received one for East Middle School for the BEST program that we put in. So
Okay.
how much they will grant you is, there's a lot of back and forth during that process, but I think they acknowledge that there is a middle school model that a lot of counties use, and that it does have an effect on the capacity calculation, so.
So on the $12 million cost, 12.7 or whatever it was, for a 10 classroom addition, there would be some state participation.
Yes, I would anticipate some, and, the 10 classroom addition is building seats for 250 students. So, if we were to justify 140 students, there will be some. Is it going to be a 50 or a 60-40? Our 59%, 41%. Probably not there, but somewhere in that range. Above, I would say above 25%, but not quite 60%. So somewhere in there. We would obviously, in our planning process and our request process, we would argue and try to convince for every eligible amount we could get from the state, and we've generally done pretty well. I think we have we work with the instructional folks to create justification that we submit to them, and the IEC is generally they want to help. Their stance has been they want to help. They want to help these projects happen. So.
And just based on the numbers that you just threw out real quickly, the back of the envelope would be like a third that we might be able to expect from the state. So, okay.
This guy.
Oh, back to me.
Back.
So the next couple pieces are, the modernization needs, and then the instructional needs, or the blueprint needs that have been identified in the master plan. So real quick, modernization needs, again, one of the major components of the facility master plan is the need to modernize our older buildings. The facility master plan has typically in the past, since 2008, prioritized the modernization schools based on the combined physical and functional assessment was done in 2008. During discussions last year, we had several schools, Liberty High being one of them, that had a high facility condition index because of the age of the building and the systems. A lot of questions of why that wasn't considered for modernization. It's because it wasn't built prior to 1980, which was the original assessment. We decided to add the schools built in the 80s and do the functional assessment so we could add those schools into the mix. The 5 schools that were added were Liberty High School, Sykesville Middle School, Hampstead Elementary, Manchester Elementary, and Mount Airy Elementary. Those are the 5 schools that were done in the 80s. We did a functional assessment. We had instructional folks go out and look at their content areas. We looked at, there were some room measurements, size of classrooms, size of spaces, all of those things that went into the original functional assessment. But we also did take time to look at the original schools for things that have changed. For instance, room changes where, the health suite in 2008 at Robert Moton was in a tiny room, and now it's been moved to a much larger room that's more adequate. Changes to standards, like the technology standards in 2008, the technology standard was data and power in every room. Now with wireless and one-to-one, it's, the technology standards have changed. So we did go back and update those original scores where we could too, based on changes that have happened. So based on the new functional assessment combined with the physical score, which is basically the FCI score, Liberty High is now the lowest scoring school, which would be the top candidate for modernization. And interestingly, Mount Airy Elementary also is at the top of the combined score. Now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper because although Mount Airy Elementary is second on this list, I think if we look at the lowest functional scores, which the functional score is how well the building meets the current instructional program, which is pretty important for a school. Liberty actually had the lowest functional, but the next two schools were William Winchester Elementary and West Middle. The lowest physical scores, which are those FCI facility condition scores, Liberty had the lowest there. Mount Airy Elementary had the second lowest physical score, and then Northwest Middle. But I just wanted to note, all three of those schools had HVAC replacement projects planned in the last year's facility master plan. If we did the HVAC replacement, it would raise the physical score because the HVAC system is roughly a third of the cost of a building. So it's a significant system. When we replace that, it really improves the score. But interestingly, Liberty, although it does significantly raise the score from 189 to 435, it would still be the lowest physical score. So I think it's pretty clear Liberty is, combined between the physical and the functional, the next modernization. Mount Airy Elementary, though, if we did the HVAC replacement, which we have funding for that project, it would raise the physical score to 582, which would take it down to the middle of the pack on that previous chart. And then Northwest Middle, again, the HVAC project would raise their score to 615, which would push it further down the list. So the draft document in front of you, the draft facilities master plan, has included the Liberty High modernization as the next one, but the future ones in that 10-year window would be William Winchester and West Middle, based on the fact that they're the lowest functional scores. And the master plan has the feasibility study to be done for both of those schools at the same time because uniquely they share a campus and are immediately next to each other. So any project at one of those schools would certainly impact the other one. So that's the modernization list and the update and kind of what's in the current plan, or the draft plan, sorry. And then we get to the blueprint facility needs for what's in the current plan before you. It's just really the pre-K expansion. And as we talked about, the enrollment projections anticipate doubling of the pre-K enrollment. And then the current plan does assume that we'll double our capacity out in 2027. And just a quick chart to kind of illustrate that. We did include on this chart at the 5 regional special education centers for elementary, there is a special ed pre-K program that has students, and those schools have special education capacity. So some of the schools, you'll see the enrollments are, the other schools are either 20 or 40 because a pre-K class is capped at 20. But those other schools, you'll see numbers where the projected enrollments and capacities are 50. And that is...
Yep, that brings us back
to John.
Discussion of how the board would like to approach the revised plan. And so as a reminder, we've presented a draft that would return for your action at your June board meeting. That leaves us on a timeline where we can get the document to the state as required by July 1. And I said this a bit earlier, I'll just, as a reminder now, whatever decisions you make today or in June when you vote on your master plan are not written in stone and you're bound by them forever. You would revisit some of this when you vote on your CIP in the September-October timeline. But with all of this background information and all of this context in mind, I think specifically what the superintendent would be looking for this evening is, does the board have any feeling on some of the SARC-related things, putting one or either or any of the feasibility study addition options into the educational facilities master plan. And then whether it's in the plan as by reference or a separate action to be brought later. What about the redistricting part of SARC? And we would have some thoughts on that, some of which we've shared. And then also on the modernizations that Bill just covered, are you comfortable with the new prioritization based on assessing the schools from 1980 to 1990, or would you like to take a different look at how that prioritization list is developed? We have on the screen Sandy Mount and William Winchester. They're two of sort of the new schools that are now on the list that even with considering pre-K expansion, still are on the list to watch in the 10-year window of the plan. And that's just sort of, is there anything the board would like there? And it could just be, let's watch that and be sure to report out to us again next year when we have an updated master plan on what to do there. And then lastly, you've yourselves arrived at many of these things throughout this conversation, but just, not specifically part of the plan, but things we wanted to highlight. There are all of these other blueprint elements out there beyond pre-K. There's what ultimately are the impact of teacher time on the capital program. I'm not sure I know what that is yet, other than I know, and we've been like Mr. Diaz and I, we meet with the union, have been saying things like many school systems, including this one, are going to have to move from a mindset of, as a teacher, this is my classroom and my desk, to something else, like shared space. But that's an element of the blueprint we haven't yet spent a ton of time on. There's a huge career and technology education component of the blueprint that we haven't talked a lot about. And then we have talked a lot about aligning resources with fiscal compliance with the blueprint. Dr. McCabe's done so many community town halls on that issue, and Mr. Whistler and others have sort of discussed that tonight. That's out there. We think we have a good sense of what compliance means. Is there any further guidance or flexibility to come from the state in the next year? We really don't know the answer to that question. So with those things in mind, I think to the extent you might look at us and say, what do you think? We do think a Sykesville addition makes some sense in any scenario. We do think at least the one addition at Freedom makes some sense for Freedom and what it would mean for the surrounding area. It may make some sense to move those forward if you want to, and then look at other options before getting back to redistricting. And for instance, like I had other schools on the list. I think during the interim report of SARC, Mike and Ray, who were the co-chairs, probably said something. I remember them saying something like, okay, now it's already looking like the work of SARC is moving into parts of the county that some folks might say, that's not the southern part of the county. And that was a year ago. And now our enrollment projections are saying we have schools that are beyond that border that are now at least on a watch list for what to consider for future action, and those two schools are two of them. So, and then there's all of those blueprint things. So I guess what we're saying as staff is we're not sure what the right level of redistricting might be right now, but it might be to try to get a better handle on all of these things.
And I would just add to that, as Mr. O'Neill said, we don't know yet what the blueprint implementation really will look like. How many teachers will we be moving? How many staff will be moving? And how will that affect enrollment in all of our schools? And so until we know the answers to those questions, it's very difficult those are a lot of details that could have big impact. And until we know the answers to those questions, it's difficult to really be able to discuss in detail redistricting either in one portion of the county or countywide.
Ms. Battaglia.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things I know we heard very strongly against was redistricting from the southern end of the county. And that's why we had looked at building one to Sykesville and Freedom, because they were very vocal, like, no, that we don't want this. And redistricting is extremely hard. It's hard to plan, it's hard to propose, it's hard to put in place, it's hard on families, you know, and many of us have been through all of that, and we get it. We know how hard it is. So, you know, I mean, I want the southern and the county to understand we're not sitting here saying, okay, we're going to start looking at redistricting, because that is not what we're doing. We're not doing that at all. It is, we have to look at going forward what we're going to be looking at. To me, I think I would like to see a study done on the modernization on Liberty, especially to get rid of the portables. Because the portables have always petrified me that where they have them outside the school. And it is, you know, it's something that it does need a high priority on modernization needs, so I think it's something we do need to look at. I do like the idea of going ahead and looking at doing the additions on Sykesville and Freedom. That would help on the modernization need scores. You know, even the pre-K. So, because we do have some pre-Ks in our high schools. Does that count towards some of the blueprint?
I don't think we've gotten a clear answer on that, have we?
Is Steve here?
Yes.
Mr. Wernick.
He was hoping for a question.
Not like he's bored.
Actually, today we had a interest meeting with as many of the private pre-Ks that were willing to come. We sent out invitations for the last month. We only had 2 additional pre-K, private pre-Ks come, and we shared our information, and they'll take it back. Not sure if they're interested, but you know, it's a 24. In all reality, it's a 24-month process to be accredited, so they'll look into that and then work with MSD if they're interested. We do have a couple partners right now, Head Start especially, that shares some of the space. Because they are a private partner, and they've gone through accreditation, they actually share our space at FSK. And so we do have pre-K students that we can count as part of, and we do, of the private-public partnership with them. We don't have, it's hard to count the pre-K classrooms that are actually like through our educational programs. And the reason is accreditation and what they're looking at MSDE. And so it's not a full day, it's not a wraparound service. There's some things that are missing. We'll continue to have them, but you know, it's up to the parents to, you know, if they choose that. So they do count, but we don't have many of them, and it's not a complete program.
Do we have a pre-K program at Liberty High School?
That I'm not aware of right now. It would be through, again, their education department.
Okay.
But,
No?
you know, it would be a program that they have.
I don't think
Okay.
we do.
So
But
Ms.
it wouldn't be a full program as we're looking at through Blueprint.
Okay. Do you have anything else, Ms. Battaglia?
Nope, that's it.
Ms. Savigny, your thoughts? I'm just going to go around because I know everybody's got thoughts, and I just thought we'll just take. Oh, get.
No, I just had a
though
question
first.
for Mr.
Sure.
Wernick before you said that we have 2 additional sites or programs that are interested in our
Well,
pre-K?
2 of them came today to the interest meeting.
So how many do we have total? Just those 2 that you're referring to?
Currently, we have 2, Head Start and a private provider, New Beginnings up in Tawnytown.
So we have 2.
And then there were 2 additional that came today just to receive the information. You know, we wanted to explain the blueprint, the process, how we would support them through the process, and see if they were interested. It's not up to us, it's up to them then to initiate conversations with the MSDE, because they would actually be partnering, and MSD would provide them the guidance to become a partner with us.
Yeah,
And then
that's-
at that point, we would support them.
Yeah, and that's pretty stringent, we know, so.
And I would say, while Steve's still there, what I hear at statewide blueprint coordinator meetings is that there's many school systems in a similar place to us.
All of them.
And maybe a couple that are saying we have a better base of private providers, but not many. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. And some of your larger districts have a little better handle just because they're larger and they have more providers. If you look at Carroll County, as I've been saying the last couple of years, our providers are smaller. They're not as large. They're not corporate. You know, they're more independent in our system, so it's harder for them to, to join what the blueprint's asking.
We've sometimes heard, this is a bit of an aside, and I'm sorry, we sometimes hear, I've heard, Carroll seems to be struggling with the blueprint or behind, or I hear the same things from my peers at all of the statewide meetings. I don't find that we're in a different place than most other Maryland school systems trying to sort out every aspect of the blueprint. I think many of us are in the same place, and I think you're hearing that more and more frequently among our 23 other school systems at meetings. I think you're hearing it at Mako.
Absolutely. No, we absolutely, and large, small, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. We are absolutely concerned. So, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Wernick. Ms. Savigny, your thoughts?
So I'm trying to think a little bit bigger picture with the capital improvement plan, right? Like, so a while back we had done, Ray and Bill, you had done those projections of saying, okay, well, in order for us to maintain our FCI score over time, not let the overall condition of the system kind of deteriorate, you have to put so much money in capital improvements every year in order to maintain that. And I think the number was somewhere in the $45 million range.
I think it's closer to 50 now, but somewhere in that 45 to $50 million a year. That's average. Right.
Okay. So I think I'd like to kind of have these discussions in combination with the CIP, right? Like if we're trying to maintain the overall condition of the system at a bare minimum, and that requires 50 million, like where are we in the range of that 50 million for the next couple of years as we're deciding on some of these projects, right? Because I think that the situation has changed since the SARC committee did their work, right? I mean, there was some additional capacity to do some shifting and some redistricting and potentially not have to do additions, but I think with the up 800 enrollment and everything, that's kind of changed. There aren't really a whole lot of seats available. Like shifting doesn't really get you anything. So I'm thinking that we need to move forward on the addition, at least the two smaller versions of the additions, right? So 5 classroom for Freedom and what was it for Sykesville? Was it
The recommendation was the larger addition for
the
Sykesville.
larger one at Sykesville? Okay. So those are $18 million worth of projects, right? So trying to understand how that fits into with the HVAC and roofs and everything else that we're still working on, if we're kind of trying to prioritize everything to make sure that we're in sort of that $50 million range on an annual basis.
Just keep in mind the $50 million range was to maintain the current inventory. It wasn't for capacity. So capacity expansion would be, if we needed to expand because we were growing, it would be 50 million just to maintain what's there. But then we would add on top of that to build capacity.
Understood.
Which is the challenge, in our growing years, and every county that grows, it's the challenge. You have to build seats, but that means your existing inventory gets older and older and poorer condition.
How-
So.
Understood.
But going with the modernizations does accomplish that goal. The modernizations are going to have more of an effect on that FCI than any of the smaller systemics and things like that. So those modernizations, especially something like Liberty, is going to have a big impact. Where exactly it would stand up, we're not sure, but that's where those are the chunks we need to take out of this thing to be able to maintain an FCI.
Understood. I mean, it's really an optimization problem at this point, trying to figure out the condition, the modernizations, the enrollment and overcrowding in some of the schools. It's trying to optimize all of that, right?
Right. This is a new dynamic to what had been the discussion. What we can
Right.
do for the June meeting is bring back the FCI information from your last CIP discussion, so you can have that in front of you at the same time that you're looking at the master plan for action that night.
Right. Yeah, I mean, effective. I think that would be helpful because I think what we're trying to do at this point is we're trying to Band-Aid things, right? Because you can't do the big slug that's going to fix the whole problem, but how do you Band-Aid it most effectively so that you're getting towards the right end goal, right? And so if the right way to stage this is, okay, we're doing the pre-K and kindergarten additions at the 4 elementary schools, right? And then if you layer on the 2 additions to Freedom and Sykesville, and then we start thinking about, okay, well, the next major modernization where we're going to get the best bang for our buck and where we have the biggest problem, if it is Liberty, then that's the next modernization that we build in, and we kind of go from there and say, okay, does this work, right? We really think that that's the optimal solution.
And Board Member Savigny, when you started your comments, I put the slides back up from the difference in SARC. The first thing that popped to me when they first provided me with this information a month or so ago was Eldersburg. So when SARC met, Eldersburg had 109 seats available for some immediate relief. The second thing that popped to me, by the way, was Linton, which was at 112 when they looked at it. But then in 1 year's shift, there's 109 seats or 39 at Eldersburg.
Right.
And that's the immediate relief. That was all of the immediate relief
evaporated.
right there. It's gone.
Yeah.
And Linton's up to what, 117 now, so, yeah.
That's exactly what I was looking at when I saw the change. I'm like, okay, the situation has changed.
Rapidly.
Right, yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Whistler?
A couple things. One, Elmer Wolf, they really stood out with me being 180% utilization with the pre-K. The thing I saw.
Currently, yeah, the
Yeah.
pre-K chart, yeah, that's they added a second pre-K program at Elmer Wolf this fall. That chart is only showing they have one dedicated or designated pre-K classroom. They had other available classrooms, so adding the program, they had a classroom to put that pre-K program in, but it's a reflection of one designated pre-K classroom versus they're running 2 classes, so.
Okay. The other thing can you give us an idea of the timeline? I mean, I know these additions at Freedom and Sykesville, it takes a while from putting a shovel on the ground to putting kids in classrooms. Can you give us an idea of the timeline?
For the 2 additions, the Freedom and Sykesville, so typically it's 2 years of planning, and for an addition, depending on the size of the addition, the smaller addition probably a year of construction, but the larger one maybe 18 months to 2 years. But the 2 years of planning is really driven by the site development process. A lot of times we can design the building, in a year, but we have to get site plan approval from the county, and there's state rules on stormwater management and forest conservation. So 2 years is kind of a safe window. If we were to include it in the facility master plan for request for design, it would be part of the fiscal year 25 CIP request to the county. That means that if they provided it, we'd have design money next July. So design would start next July, and then it would be 2 years. So it's several years out. If the decision was made now to include it, that's why it is a difficult thing, because decisions do need to be made to get the process started, and it's so long. But sometimes the information is, changing. But keep in mind the design process, isn't as costly as building the addition. So if things change, and when you're in the planning or design, that it's not like we can't pivot.
Sure.
We also have to be cautious about when we're starting with these additions. So that has to fall into play. So once we're at a certain point, we're pushed to be able to start. So we have to get that work done while there's no one in the building. There's a certain amount of work we need to do to maintain that, to get that separation in place. So that can drive to, a build, between the design and the actual shovel in the ground, that can take up some time.
Sure. So it sounds like it's a 3 to 4 year process for Freedom, and maybe even a 4 to 5 year process for Sykesville. But that doesn't, that's a great long-term plan, but we have, our fantastic principals back there, they're already busting at the seams now with students.
And that's where the portable classrooms come into play, and that's kind of why they were invented.
And it's just a terrible security concern.
Yeah, right.
And not a very conducive environment for our teachers or students. But, Yeah, so, I mean, initially, I'm on board with, the recommendation for the larger project at Sykesville and the smaller project for Freedom, but we've really got to sit down and, I guess, assess how this 75% compensatory ed thing, and again, I know you can't do it now, but I would love to see in the next year or so, another column added to your spreadsheet that shows the average teacher-student ratio at the schools, because I am very concerned about if we are forced to move teachers around, we need to really get a hold of a handle on just what kind of inside renovations we need to do to accommodate larger class sizes. But
So
again,
appendix-
I know you can't do it now.
In,
but
in the complete document that's in your packet, the facility master plan, Appendix B is the class size report that got presented to the board in November, which has those, for the current school year, has those average class sizes.
right, but I'm saying when we move teachers around.
Yeah, well, yeah, right, that's a few, at
Yeah,
some
but I'm
point.
just saying, in a year and a half from now, it'd be nice to see that on a major dashboard. Thank you.
Dr. Dorsey?
Well, let me just say, first of all, concerning the redistricting options, when we're having just a regular operating procedures in place, redistricting is certainly challenging. So it's challenging just because of the nature of what it involves. So at this point, since we have so many unanswered questions related to blueprint, so many things are still up in the air, redistricting certainly would become super challenging. So I'm certainly not advocating for that at all, because I don't think, have enough pieces to the puzzle to do anything really effectively concerning that. As far as the additions are concerned, I certainly support additions at both Freedom and Sykesville. I appreciate the feasibility studies and how specific those studies are. I really came in thinking that I would want to support the larger addition at Freedom Elementary, just to give us more of a long-range kind of handle on the numbers. I hear what you're saying about the site, and I know that that's the biggest con, I guess, that was indicated in the feasibility study. Again, that size space there just is very, very small. And I hear what you're saying, that we would wind up then having the largest elementary school on the smallest site. So you raised some compelling issues concerning that. Again, initially, I would really want to see the more classrooms at Freedom to give us more of a long-range handle on the planning. But I hear what you're saying, and because of that, I can go with the smaller addition there at Freedom. If there was any way that we could change anything, and I know we can't really change the lot that the land is on. So I guess I would have to go with the smaller addition for Freedom Elementary. But I do appreciate what we would be able to realize, especially at Sykesville Middle with having the 10 classrooms added. I just wish we could do more for Freedom, I guess, is my bottom line thought there.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Mr. Wernick, for that information about outside providers. And I kind of hit that on the nail because they do not want to do it. So it looks like we're going to be holding the bag on that one. So we're going to have to do all that. I'm definitely in for the modernizations, big one at Sykesville, the smaller one at Freedom, just because of size. And as I said, I am against any redistricting right now because we have blueprint. And we have too many
Balls in the air.
too many things going
many
on
unknowns.
and unknowns.
Many unknowns.
And I don't think it would be fair to those people. And as I said before, redistricting has not gone well in this county. And I will tell her, dear Delegate Krebs never got it through either. And God bless her, because she has done a lot of work for this county. But as I said several meetings ago, if you live and look out your back door and you see Freedom Elementary in your back window, they do not want their child bused to Linton Springs. So, and I know that's an exaggeration, but I think we have a lot on our plate, and number one is Blueprint, and I think this was great, and I want to thank you all for this hard work, because that is not my thing, these numbers and all that. But I think we need to go with the 2 modernizations, and I think we all agree.
You mean the additions?
The additions, yes. Those 2 additions, with the big and small, and we're gonna have to put that redistricting on the back burner and go forward. And definitely, Liberty High School needs to be addressed. We need to really look at
Can I
that.
say a couple things?
Well, you're next. We're going right around. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm not
Commissioner
gonna,
Rothstein.
I'm not gonna talk about,
You go right ahead.
your decisions that you're making, because that's your responsibility, and I appreciate it. And also, I agree with those decisions. When I first came into office, redistricting was very much on my mind, and I pushed that. And I pushed to take a hard look at the southern area and the effects it would have in redistricting the southern area into the entire county, because it wasn't just one area or another. And so I really appreciated the SARC. I appreciated the work that was done. You know, in the military, we say the enemy has a vote. And the enemy, we could call it the state sometimes with Blueprint, because it's not defined. We can call the enemy COVID. We can call the enemy lots of things. But a lot of things happened over the last 2-3 years where you got to change. And that's where that redistricting is not the right time for that. I do want to make a point of clarification. When you allocate dollars for design, you should be really thinking about allocating dollars for design and execution and the build. Not, oh, I'm just going to put X amount of dollars for design and then later on look at additional dollars. What is the cost going to be? Get that allocated. Do the full ask, okay? Because if you do, if you don't, you end up with some dollars, and then you said pivot. It's always a dangerous word, you know, so, you know, the idea is to.
That's not what I'm, you know,
Okay.
we include the whole request. My
Okay.
point is dollars spent. Like, if we're early in design and we decide to do something,
Okay.
it's dollars spent. You're not far along in the process, so.
Okay, yeah,
Sorry about that.
just, okay. And I learned that from Ted, who's there. So if I didn't say that, he'd probably hit me on the head, so no. The other thing is, you know, I kept looking up at the quote, building the future. And really that's what it's about, is building a future for our kids and for, you know, the Carroll Countyans. You can't boil the ocean, so you can't do everything. So what can we do? And if it's building these, you know, additions to Sykesville Middle and Freedom, we're building a more viable future for those kids, because on social media you see a lot of cars parked on the sides of the road, especially during special events in the elementary schools. It's very, very challenging and very frustrating. You know, so if this alleviates some of that, that's great, you know, making it more conducive to learning, you know, that's what it's about. So it is all about building the future. And I know it's just not going to stop there. That's the tactical, operational solution right now. You know, the operational strategic is Blueprint, and we're going to figure that one out together. So I appreciate having the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for being here.
And
We appreciate it.
always, you know, if we can continue to message together,
Absolutely.
that's what we got to do.
That's
So,
what we have to.
okay, thanks.
Now we're going to go, Ms. Tedeschi. Did I say that right? I was always afraid that I was always going to mess that up.
Good day.
You're correct. So I completely agree with moving forward with the smaller Freedom Edition and the larger Sykesville Edition, particularly because my concern with Freedom is if we use that 9-classroom edition to alleviate other schools, then we're moving other districts into the Freedom District. But then what happens when that Freedom District grows to the point where we don't have space to alleviate other schools? Then we're moving those students right back to where they came from. So I'd like to see that money either utilized to then work on the modernization of Liberty High School and other schools so that in the future, when we have Blueprint, which is now completely moved students, we can look at that money, not have to be so concerned with as many modernizations, and then delegate that money to, do we need money at Oklahoma School Middle to add additions there if that's where the need is, because Freedom and Sykesville are different districts, they're different routes for students. So my concern would be that we'd be spending money in 2 different areas, and then we're just moving students back and forth between Freedom and Sykesville, which isn't what the pathway they should be going. So I think that's all I have for that. So I completely agree. At this point, we don't have enough Blueprint information to make really any decision, but we do need to start moving forward due to the timeline of expansions.
Thank you. Dr. McCabe, would you like to put your 2 cents in?
Well, thank you for all of your input, and again, to staff for putting this information together for all of us. You know, I am, as I said in the beginning, I am on board for looking at what we can do without redistricting right now, because of the unknowns of Blueprint. As we get more answers over the next year or 2, we should be in a better place to understand what we can do as far as redistricting goes, but we're just not there right now. I am very comfortable with moving forward on the additions for Sykesville and for Freedom and for putting a modernization for Liberty High School on the list. It was interesting to see how the needs of the schools changed so rapidly since the last time we looked at the modernization needs. So, you know, I think this has been a great opportunity to take a few different issues that we were facing and put those issues together and come up with a solution that encompassed a lot of different areas into one work session. So, thank you.
Ms. Savigny.
I just did want to add one other thing to the conversation, and John, I think you had it in your questions on the last slide for board direction.
Oh, there it was.
Where you were talking about William Winchester and Sandy Mount, right? Because now the Westminster elementary schools are starting to get into a similar situation as the southeast area, right? And Sandy Mount in particular, the reason why I bring that one up is because we're already going to be in there doing the kindergarten and the pre-K edition, right? So we're going to be putting in 3. But when you look at the projections, even with that factored in, you're still at inadequate capacity, right? So we're still in the 116% range, even after those additions are built. Does it make sense to do more while we're already in there?
That's a question.
Yeah.
I think we wanted to highlight it for a couple of reasons. One, back to SARC. SARC went as far as Mechanicsville, and next is Moton and Sandy Mount.
Yeah.
So it was sort of putting pressure there. And then 2, across the plan, even with I think, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, even with the pre-K considered, those 2 schools remain or are become inadequate during the 10-year window of the plan. So they're sort of at a place where the southern area was some years ago. And so what, if anything, would the board like to do now? So it could be watch it very carefully and report to us some options next May. It could be reconsider some of the projects that are underway. That's ultimately your discretion as a board as you consider the plan next month and beyond. And we've said everything but maybe this about the plan. The plan can also be amended. It's not that it can't. We do have to turn it into the state on a deadline, But I believe in my time here, we've amended the Educational Facilities Master
Right.
Plan before, so it's, you know, nothing's final necessarily in
Right.
the larger picture, so that's a viable consideration. Anything
Yeah, I
you
was saying,
wanna
because
add?
William Winchester and Sandy Mount, like you said, are in a similar sort of situation. William Winchester is a little bit further back, and
And
like,
also-
I feel like we could probably wait one more year to kind of reassess that one next year. But the reason I'm saying about Sandy Mount is because we're already going to be doing work on that site. So does it make sense to kind of take care of a little bit bigger of a problem at the same time? I mean, you run into a similar situation as Freedom, as it's, I think, the second smallest site. But it feels different than the Freedom situation because you've got Sandy Mount Park like all over to the side. So it feels like a much bigger site than it truly is. You don't have that luxury at the Freedom site. So I think it's less of a problem to do that
So
at
it's,
Sandy Mount.
it's certainly a question, I think, obviously, and I believe a member of the planning committee asked the question, you know, during our kindergarten pre-K planning committee meetings just a few weeks ago. This, and we could certainly look, we're going to hire an architect here shortly. You know, I think it's coming to the next board meeting for award. We could certainly ask them to look into it. The difficult thing is to address the projections at Sandy Mount and where they'll be in 5 years. It would be taking Sandy Mount to a 5-round school, again, 5 classrooms per grade level. And that's a choice. Is that the right area? There's blueprint implications on staffing potentially. It is on well and septic, so it's not, Freedom is on public water, public sewer. Sandy Mount is out in the county, not in a growth area. It would be on a well and septic, and whether we can expand as much there is somewhat more questionable. But it certainly could be looked into. But again, I guess we would need, that's a question, we'd need direction.
That we don't own the park.
And right,
No, understood.
right, the parking lot is basically where our property line ends. The fields are where, you know, the county owns the fields to the right of the school.
Yeah. My son went to Sandy Mount, and it's got a very small cafeteria. It's a lot of things more than just, but yeah, it's a good thing to think about. If you're there already, why not look at it?
So the board could address that in the master plan or in the scope of the feasibility study. There's a couple of different ways you could direct us to look further into that. And maybe the scope of the feasibility study makes the most sense. It doesn't cost you that much more to have that information.
That
So-
would be the time to
So
do
we're
it.
actually in design on this project at Sandy Mount. We'd be hiring an architect to start schematic design, but we could certainly ask
We
at the,
ask 'em to-
during the concept phase, which is schematic design, we could ask them to look at, is it feasible or possible? That schematic design does come to the board for approval. I mean, it is a possibility.
Good recommendation.
Is that, I guess we'd look to the board for that nod to do that.
They're already gonna be there.
Right. Absolutely.
Great. Then we will do that. They've been making notes all night of all the things we will do.
Yeah.
That
Okay,
will
we're
be
not
one.
losing sight of William Winchester.
Right.
Keeping that
No.
Well, and
on
the,
our
Keep that on
radars.
the
Yeah,
well
we got,
to-
can't do that.
and the other thing about Willie is it remains a priority for modernization
Right.
too. And so if it were
Right.
to be modernized in a 10-year glimpse of time, that a lot of that could be addressed at the same time. So that's a bit of a difference there. But yeah, there's some places to start looking at. And if I may, one concluding thought on SARC really quickly, because I didn't say this tonight. I don't want anyone, especially anyone who served on SARC, which included staff members from the county and parents from the potentially impacted sites, to believe that their work was in vain. I don't believe that it
No,
was. And
absolutely not.
and I do believe as we move forward, the logic, the methodologies they came up with, we have that, and we will continue to utilize that, consider it for different options moving forward. And I do think, based on the direction we've heard this evening, in addition to bringing back the master plan for you in June, looking the way we've discussed, we'll also, the superintendent will also send out notes of gratitude to the members of SARC for their service, kind of giving them a glimpse of where we are now and how the board's moving forward. But if any of them are tuning in, we do want to make sure that their work was appreciated and they gave up. Like Ray and Mike have to go because I said so, but those parents didn't have to and the county staff didn't have to, so we appreciate
Yeah,
the
what
the
they
hours
did was
gave.
tremendous, and we
Yes.
certainly appreciate all of their efforts. you know. So that has sort of become the springboard
Yes.
for our
For a lot
work
of
here.
things, yeah.
It's
Very
really
well said.
shaped a lot of our
Yeah,
thinking,
it
right? It
has.
helped us get our arms around it, so.
Dr. McCabe will capture all of that in her letter.
Which you'll have on our desk tomorrow, right?
All right, well, we've given you all some ideas, thoughts, and work to do. And this concludes this meeting, and thank you all for putting the input. Thank you there in the audience too for your input also, and you all have a good evening. We will be headed to Gateway graduation, and I just received a lovely thank you note for our Teacher of the Year to the board, so I will pass that around from Lauren. All right, have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.